Okay, welcome everybody to this presentation. This is a presentation on poverty in the Arab world. The initial focus of the study was on Morocco, but the presentation is more than that, since it's also comparison with the two countries in the Mashrek, Egypt and Syria. First slide, please. So, what's the starting point of this paper was that with the UNDP dealing most with the poverty issues in the region, were impressed by the trend of poverty in Morocco. If you look at the Moroccan case, you will see that poverty over the last decade declined by some 40%, while in other countries in the region, Syria and Egypt being among the countries that are comparable to Morocco. Since you can also take Tunisia or Jordan, but they are small countries, and so Syria and Egypt are more comparable to Morocco. You have not the same trends. You don't have the same trends. So the question was, what was behind this achievement in Morocco? When I went to Morocco, when I started this project, I asked a number of economists in Morocco, a number of policymakers as well, and I had mainly four explanations. Just the first one is some people thought that it's a statistical illusion. It's just numbers, statistical illusion. I don't buy this explanation for a number of reasons. First, we have here a change, not a level. So, not trusting all the data is not correct, because we normally, even if it's illusion, if it's systematically illusion, the change should be good. So this is one thing. The second thing is the surveys on living standards are usually done with the supervision or jointly with the World Bank or with UNDP. So it's really difficult to cheat. The third thing is that statistics from Arab countries are not all rosy. There are a lot of bleak statistics, a lot of very bad official statistics. So at least for these three reasons, I don't buy this explanation. The second explanation is macroeconomics. Macroeconomics, some tell you that Morocco doubled its GDP growth if you compare what we call the lost decade, the 90s, with the last decade. So we moved from 2.5 to 5%. This could be a potential explanation, but then if you look at the average growth rate in the other countries, there is no difference. Morocco achieved 5% of GDP in the decade 2000-2010, compared to 4.9 in Egypt and 4.7 in Syria. So macroeconomics is not a convincing explanation of the achievement in poverty reduction. Back, please. The third explanation is the monarch initiative to fight poverty. Some told me that it's the King initiative. So this is also is not a convincing explanation for two reasons. The first reason is the data on poverty is on 2007-2008. The King's initiative started in end of 2006. So it's too early for this initiative to produce such a big effect in poverty. The second argument is the size of this initiative. Although in terms of communication, it's much there is much more communication about this initiative than other initiatives. But in terms of its budget, it's only 0.3% of GDP compared to 12% of GDP spent by the government on social policies. So this initiative, although it can create some dynamics, but it's still too small and too early to say anything about it. The third factor is the role of NGOs. Some of my interviews said that it's the role of of NGOs. In fact, over the last decade, there is a proliferation of NGOs in Morocco. We have more than 40,000 NGOs. And they have, in fact, done a lot of things. Services in rural area, literacy programs, etc., etc. But this explanation should not leave the fact that the regime itself created its NGOs, that it's not a complete independent civil society movement that achieved this poverty reduction, but it's also used by the regime as a tool to weaken political parties in some circumstances and diffuse the contestation, since we, instead of having this contestation at the central level, we have it diffused at the local level. So this is also not to exaggerate the role of NGOs in driving policies in Morocco. So the explanation in the paper and in this study is a multi-factor explanation. So there are many factors. Some of them are related to state, some to non-state actors. There is an interaction. So this is why what I'm trying to explain in this paper. Next, please. So one important factor of in explaining this the poverty trend in Morocco and comparing it to Syria and Egypt is demographic behavior. So if you compare the data on fertility rates, for instance, you see that Morocco recorded a rapid demographic transition that reduced the pressure on households' budget and public investment. Look at the data. Fertility rate in Syria in the early 80s is much higher, 7.2 children by women. Egypt 5.5 and 5.4. But you see that the trend, the declining trend in Morocco, we are at 2.4, while you still have higher fertility rate in other countries. So you have the same, almost the same GDP growth, but since you have different growth of population, so GDP per capita, next please, GDP per capita grow at different pace then. You see it here. Syria has grown at 1.6, while Egypt 2.8 and Morocco 3.6%. So you see that we see now the difference. It's because of this difference in demographic behavior. Just for your information, I tried to compute how much time, if we grow at this pace, we need to double the per capita GDP in the three countries. So you need 20 years to double GDP per capita in Morocco. You need 25 years in Egypt and 40 years in Syria. China, for instance, you need only 8 years because they have a higher GDP growth and a very low fertility rate. So they only need 8 years to double their GDP per capita. So different demographic trends are very important in terms of poverty reduction, because having less youth in Morocco compared to Egypt and Syria means less pressure on the labor market, less pressure on public investment, while Morocco invested more money on rural roads, on electricity, on water provision. Syria and Egypt had to struggle with more current spending, more subsidies and social transfers to keep up with its growing population. So this is a very important difference in terms of poverty reduction. The second factor is more fiscal space in Morocco, with stable fiscal resources compared to the Egypt and Syria. You have here the indicator of tax revenues as a share of GDP. Syria it's 11%, Egypt it's 15%, and Morocco is 24%. So we have more taxes in Morocco compared to Egypt and Syria. In Syria and Egypt, you still have, in Syria, for instance, you still have 10%, please go back, you still have 10%, 10 to 11% coming from oil sector. In Egypt, you have 9%, you have the Suez Canal revenues, and as well as some oil revenues. So this is a very important difference, and in Syria it's a problem since you have this depleting resources, oil resources, which means that the country has to collect more fiscal more taxes in order to be able to finance its public spending. The third factor is banks, the role of banks. When you take the credit to the private sector as a share of GDP, Morocco it's 80%, Egypt 49%, and Syria 18%. Syria had just started to privatize banks and extend credits to private sector, because most of the credit before was extended to public enterprises. So the credit here in Morocco benefit both firms and households. And there was a special program, for instance, for household to show how the impact of the banking credit channeled to the poverty. A special guarantee fund that allows bank to be covered from risk in dealing with low income and informal workers. So there is a special fund. So these people can now have credit to buy their houses or cars or things like that. So this is very important for poverty reduction. But more directly, you have the role of microcredit associations. Microcredit associations lifted liquidity constraints on the poor. If you take the Arab region, and it's very impressive, the whole Arab region, Morocco dominates with 59% of loans. The whole Arab region, 59% of microcredit loans are extended in Morocco. In Egypt, it's 35%. You can imagine already the difference. Morocco is 30 million, Egypt is 80 million. But you have 50 and 35. Syria is only 1%. Between 2003 and 2008, the loans multiplied by 10 in Morocco. The number of borrowers in Morocco is 1.3 million. In Egypt, it's less than 1 million. It's only 870,000 borrowers. So this is very important. The second thing important is 1.3 million, 80% of them, 80% are from rural zones. And 2/3 are female. So this is very important because you have in these poor households, 70% of poverty is in rural area. In Morocco, 70% of poverty is in rural. So if you can channel money to these rural areas, you can fight poverty. So this is also a very important thing that shows that there is a clear difference between Morocco, Egypt, and Syria. even in terms of regulation, Morocco regulated the microcredit sector, because once you have regulation, you can have foreign funds, for instance. Foreign donors are interested, but you need to have regulations. Morocco regulated the microcredit sector in 2000. It has been regulated only in 2007 in Syria and 2009 in Egypt. So it shows you a clear difference. The fifth factor is the redistributive role of remittances. Remittances, very important source of redistribution between immigrants and their families. If you compute the per capita, remittances per capita, you have $41 in Syria, $101 in Egypt, and $216 in Morocco. So which means that per capita GDP in Morocco, 216 are coming from remittances, which is very important if you compare to 41 in Syria or 101. In addition, immigrants provided also financial support for social projects in their native regions. And they contributed by, for instance, roads, in electricity, generators, etc., etc. So this is also an important channel to poverty reduction. Sixth factor is better governance indicators in Morocco compared to Egypt and Syria. In fact, the issue here is about NGOs essentially, but since I didn't have the experience of NGOs in Egypt and Syria, I prefer to compare governance. NGOs development being one dimension of governance. So NGOs in Morocco, they have a formal partnership with the state in many areas, like in construction of rural roads, electricity provision in rural area, as well as water provision. And the second thing is that NGOs in Morocco are legally allowed to receive funds from international donors. So this amendment has been introduced in 2002 to allow NGOs to receive funds from international donors, which you don't have in the other two countries. And this dimension of governance is confirmed by the other dimensions. When you look at the other dimensions computed by Daniel Kaufman at the World Bank, you have much better governance indicators in terms of government effectiveness, in terms of regularity, quality, control of corruption in Morocco compared to the other two countries. Okay. So, if I come back to, please come back to, if I come back to my initial question, I have here enough evidence that it's not really statistical illusion, as we said. It's not just macroeconomics. There are objective factors that can explain the achievement. Now, this achievement has limits. The first limit is the decline in poverty has not been matched by an improvement in human capital. So poverty reduced, but if you look at illiteracy rate, 10 plus, you have 70% rural females. You have 42% rural males. You have 40% overall. So this is, I would say, a shame to have poverty reduction, but to still have such high rates of illiteracy. If you go and compare with the other countries, Morocco is lagging behind compared to both Egypt and Syria. Illiteracy rate for 15 plus, the last statistics by UNDP, published in 2009 and based on statistics of 2007, show that Syria 16.9 illiteracy rate, Egypt 33.6, and Morocco 45.4 As a consequence, UNDP ranking for Morocco is 130, Egypt 123, and Syria 17. And Morocco is complaining all the time that he is not correctly ranked. But you see that although it has done some achievement in terms of poverty, and there are a lot of things in terms of economy, microcredit, banking credit, etc., but this is a dimension where there is a lot to do. And the next, government effort to fight illiteracy. The first bar is the population 10 plus. So 10 plus, we have 25.4 million. Those who are illiterate is 9.10 among 10 plus. Okay, should we design programs to introduce literacy program for 9.8 million? This is the question. I just take the case where we want to have illiteracy programs or literacy program for people who are between 10 and 45. By the way, some Moroccan policymakers complain that because they have high life expectancy, it triggered high literacy rates compared to other countries, because if you have lower life expectancy, people would die and your literacy rate would improve. One solution. But let's say just you have 5 million of people between 10 and 45 who are illiterate. The beneficiaries of literacy programs in Morocco is just 0.66, which means less than 1 million. 12%, the coverage rate is 12%. So I don't see how we can improve our ranking in terms of human capital with such efforts, and they put efforts quote unquote. The second issue is inequality. Inequality pattern in Morocco has been persistent, which means that the gap between the rich and the poor is not and has not been reduced. If you take the consumption inequality, and I will say why I'm talking here precisely about consumption inequality, it's measured by Gini index, which just, if you have 0, this means that you have a perfect equality, and if you have 100%, this means that just one guy has everything and all others have nothing. So, which means that here you have more inequality in Morocco compared to Egypt and to Syria. The richest 10% in Morocco have or spend 33% compared to Egypt 27 and Syria 24. The 10% poorest in Morocco spend 2.7%. So it's clear from the both indicators that you have much more inequality in Morocco than in Egypt and Syria. And this is a problem because people care about their neighbors. If you are poor and everybody is poor, it's okay. But if you are poor and surrounded by rich people, it's a problem. Which means that with this trend of inequality, the achievement in poverty is not as cannot be qualified as an achievement, because it should also lead to some reduction of poverty. So this is a problem. So why are we having such high inequality? Because there is weak redistribution. The role of both taxes and spending, you can tighten or reduce the inequality through taxes or through spending. So if we look at taxes, we said earlier that Morocco has a highest share of taxes. But who pay taxes? It's mainly wage earners. If you take, for instance, in Morocco, you have exemption of agriculture. One might say, yes, this is a good thing, because agriculture is 40% of the labor force in Morocco, 15 to 18% of GDP. But in fact, if you look at the land distribution, 70% of farmers have less than 5 hectares. The average is 2 hectares. Economically, we know that with 2 hectares, you don't make profit. So these people would be exempted anyway, because under the income taxation, if you earn less than $2,000 a year, you are exempted. So who then benefit? Large farmers. Okay, I took the distribution of land, it's official data, and you have 5% of farmers own 1/3 of land, which means that you have wealth inequality is even much higher than consumption inequality. Because consumption inequality, you have 10% of richest have 1/3% of consumption, but only 5% have 1/3 of land, and they are exempted. If you look at, so this is taxes. If you look at property taxes, they are very, very low. Property taxes. You pay taxes on income, but not. If you look at spending now, spending, what's the role or redistribution role of spending? Subsidies, for instance, subsidies, consumption subsidies, they represent 2 to 4% depending on prices. But who benefit from subsidies? If you take food subsidies, it's bread. Bread is subsidized, but not grains. In urban area, we consume bread, but in rural area, we buy grains or we grow cereals and we consume them. Then it's not poor people who benefit most from subsidies. If you take the incentives, there is a whole package of incentives for for agriculture. And I have gone through them. Most incentives are on investment and equipment. Who can buy a tractor if you have only 2 hectares? So which means that all these incentives are not for the poor. So you don't have redistribution either through neither through taxes nor through spending. Okay, the third factor, and we are back to the agriculture, is the fact that those poor in agriculture sector are very vulnerable to volatility of and irregularity of weather conditions. And you can see that real GDP growth in Morocco, although I said the average was 5%, but the agriculture sector is very volatile, which means that you have poor farmers are subjected to volatility and can fall in poverty because of succession of drought years. So, which means that the sustainability of the trend of poverty reduction is questionable. The fourth thing is a large number of jobs created over the last decade are of bad quality and concentrate in informal and precarious occupations. So you also have the fact that you probably have some income, but this income is coming from precarious occupation. And the fifth factor is that the vibrant dynamics of NGOs is losing momentum over the last few years. It's true that Morocco has known a political openness early 2000, and you have this huge proliferation of NGOs, but not over the last few years. You have more tightening, and I will explain that also through the Monarch initiative and how NGOs are involved in this initiative. So, which is the sixth factor. Please. So the Human Development Initiative, which is the Monarch Initiative to fight poverty, was launched in 2005. And there are very high expectations towards this initiative, especially for, you know, people in not in the center, but in different localities, because the king is visiting them, etc. So there is a huge amount of expectation. In addition to what I said before, in terms of the budget of this initiative, there is imperfect targeting of the poorest segment of the population. I have a graph, but I don't show here, but although the initiative was meant to target the poorest segments, the money ended up in regions that are not the poorest regions. So this is a very important thing, which means that there is a high resistance to change the situation, and there is a component, bureaucracy component, that make, even if there are, I would say, good intentions, end up being bad results. You also have weak mobilizations of extra resources. So the initiative started with a budget of 10 billion dirhams, which is $1 billion or something, 1.2. But there are no much leverage mechanisms, so it's very weak. The third thing is unbalanced governance structures. With this initiative in Morocco, we have made some progress in terms of decentralization, and you have local governments that have some fiscal resources that mainly coming from the state, and they have some also areas where they intervene directly, like infrastructure, etc. But the problem with this initiative, since this initiative is coming from the center, it leads to weakening this decentralization, since the state is deciding, or the central state is deciding, and the local government are just executing what has been decided. And the fourth factor is non-transparent mechanism of involving NGOs. The impression that NGOs have is that most NGOs that benefited from this initiative are opportunistic NGOs, sometimes created by people in the local governments to benefit from grants from the government. So the impact or the participation, because there was the slogan of the participation through this initiative, has not really been achieved through this initiative. And this confirms the fact, what I said before, that the King initiative cannot be, in addition to the fact that it's too small and too early, it's also the fact that there are many flaws in its implementation that makes it not a potential explanation of the poverty decline in Morocco. Okay. Next. So what are the policy lessons and policy recommendations for the future? I think that Morocco needs to review its approach to poverty alleviation and benefit from the strength that we have seen. I mean, having a flourishing banking sector, microcredit, having a fiscal base, solid fiscal base, etc., are strength. But at the same time, there are weaknesses. And a long-term sustainable strategy for me should be based on 4 pillars. First, it's imminent and very emergent to declare fight against illiteracy as a national priority and devote exceptional resources to build human capital. We cannot do much with 45% of the population illiterate. The second thing is reduce inequality through adequate public redistribution policies. And we saw that there is room to introduce redistribution policies both through taxes and through spending. More targeted spending, more rational spending, and also more fairness and equity in terms of tax policies. The third is provide decent jobs and create incentives for informal entrepreneurs to establish formally. And this will require improving governance, because one of the factors that also limit the establishment of small and micro firms formally is the fact that you have corruption, you have complicated regulation, you have ineffective government, etc. So sometimes small, and most often small entrepreneurs prefer to establish formally to escape from all these things. The fourth and the last is strengthen the process of decentralization and provide more space for an effective participation of non-state actors, local elected councils, as well as civil society organization in shaping and implementing social policies. So this is the last, and thank you for your attention, and I welcome your comments and contribution to this presentation. Thank you.
You listed the sort of the successes, and then in a way the failures. A few questions about that. First, do the failures disqualify the successes? In other words, because there were those failures, does it mean these successes were bought at the expense of certain failures, hence the successes are not genuine successes? I think not, but the way it's presented, you put all the successes, then you put all the failures, the listener or the reader, so I guess it wasn't, even, maybe it comes out to zero at the end. The second point is that what's interesting, at least to me, is the successes. The story in this part of the world is, we all know the typical failures, but how, and especially that Morocco still has major failures, as you indicate, how were these successes achieved? Because the failures are common failures, you'll see it in many Arab countries, but you don't see the successes. So to my mind, sort of the paper, it's about the successes in a way, yes, at the end one has to say, A third point about this is when you look then for Morocco at the end, you look at how to fix the failures. Are there any lessons from the approaches taken in the successes? This new approach. It was interesting that it was microcredit, and it was, where the banks and the private sector. So there's the tax base was different, and that was an advantage. Remittances were a big issue. Are there any lessons learned in the successes that would even help come up with a fresh approach for these, how to fix even the failures in Morocco? Because your recommendations at the end seem to be straightforward, or let's say standard, and let's fight illiteracy, improve jobs. But have we learned anything special to bring to those things? Finally, because you began saying, this is a paper about Morocco, yes, but we want to also see what lessons there are. The rest of the region, and maybe some other countries in the world, will be interested in the successes. That's what they want to learn from and try to take to their country. And hence, specifically towards the end, yes, you have recommendations for Morocco, which is obviously necessary. But what are the takeaway lessons for the rest of the region, or at least the big poor countries in the region, at least Egypt, Syria, and others? I would imagine there are lessons in microcredit, there are lessons in taxation, there are lessons in remittances, there are lessons to credit to the private sector that you mentioned. And I think it would be useful to devote a bit more time or detail to these successes and what can we learn from them. And, you know, if you go to Egypt and say, you know, remittances need to be improved, I mean, is there, you know, what's the policy lesson? I mean, Morocco has a lot of people in Europe, you know, but did they introduce any policies or something specific that allowed them to get $216 per capita? Because there are so many countries who could learn from that. So I think those are some of my general questions and comments.
Oh, okay. Let me try to answer these questions and comments. I think I try to be balanced in the approach. I'm not. I try to look at 4 objective factors that explain the success, which is, I think, challenging because most people thought that it's not maybe the case. But then I tried also to be convincing when I was dealing with failures. But now, of course, successes are very important, and let us try to learn something more from the successes. The first thing related to demographics is the fact that Morocco started earlier doing this, campaigns on reducing and organizing family and on the TV, etc. So it started early before. In Egypt, they started and then they stopped. They started and then the president said that the development is the best contraceptive. Then they stopped and then they resumed recently.
Sorry if I may.
Yeah.
Speaking of stopping and resuming, you should have maybe before the question and answer asked people to get something to eat.
Yes, please.
I know he's coming around, but please feel free to step up. And continue. Just a minute.
Okay, so this is a first factor. The factor of fiscal resources. Morocco has no other, has no oil. So I mean, from the beginning, Morocco has to base its spending on mainly taxes. In a period of time, there was also privatizations, and also this is a very important point I'm developing in the paper, is how to use strategically your privatization revenues. I think in Morocco they decide when the process started, it has been decided that 50% of the revenues will be put in a fund, and the fund will exclusively serve for infrastructure. So this is a lesson, because other countries has just spent the money on subsidies or current spending and didn't use it strategically. This is very important. And the fund created much more leverage, because when you contact an international donor and you have already a portion of money they can also complement it and contribute to the project. So this is very important, and thanks to that, there was an achievement in terms of infrastructure. Should really recognize it. Recently, I have been in Morocco, and I went to my native city in the south, and I took the highway, so which is very interesting. So instead of 8 hours, it just takes 4 hours. So strategic use of privatization revenues. Morocco started also the fiscal reforms earlier, much earlier than in Egypt and Syria. So the issues of IT that we have now in Syria, that VAT took time to be introduced in Egypt and in Syria, Morocco has already revenues from VAT generalized, etc. So there is more stable fiscal resources. We have higher income rates, tax rates in Morocco compared to Egypt and Syria. It's also because wages are higher in public sector in Morocco compared to Egypt and Syria. And the number of, or the share of civil servants in Morocco compared to Egypt and Syria is lower. So this strategy of intensive employment in the public sector has not been in Morocco. So it's also a good thing, because we don't have to pay a lot of money to sustain this. Credit extension, Morocco also started privatizing banks and allowing foreign ownership in the local banks much earlier than Egypt and Syria. So, and there is more competition among banks, which means for the banks that they have to be more commercially oriented, market oriented, and less interest rates, etc. Related to the banking and credit extension is also macro management in general, because in Morocco you have less inflation rate compared to Egypt and Syria, and when you have less inflation rate, it's much interesting for interest rates, because you have less interest rate than if you have high inflation rate. You can have interest rate that are 20% or 15%. It's much costly to have a credit. The microcredit issue started with NGOs, and this is why I said that it's the trend of NGOs. It's a pity if it's now losing momentum, because the state is now taken like a tough attitude toward NGOs, because we had the events of 2003 with bombing, and it turns out that Islamic association or Islamist associations were also very, very active in the country. So there was a tough attitude toward all NGOs. And maybe this is not the good attitude to have, and regarding the contribution, the positive contribution of NGOs in microcredit, in literacy, in local programs, as I said, formal partnership between the state and the other. In other countries, they always and continue to have a very careful and cautious attitude toward NGOs. So NGOs can be good, and involving them and making them participate could be good. There should be a way to have more contribution of NGOs. And I think that related to the issues I said at the end, literacy, for instance, it's much easier and much more realistic to count also on local NGOs to fight illiteracy than to count on a central government that would organize everything at the local level. Remittances. Very important also as a key lesson. It's that once you have $216, it's really the largest, I would say, sector in Morocco. Although they are already out, they don't compete for jobs in Morocco, so they are leaving their places and they are sending money. So it's the best thing to have. You said already, their location. Moroccan are in Europe. Egyptian are in Gulf countries. Does it make a difference? Certainly, because there are studies on the Moroccan immigration and the impact on local level, and there are a lot of partnership between the countries, the hosting countries and the countries of origin, initiated by immigrants from Belgium, from France, from Holland, etc. You don't have the same in Saudi Arabia or in Qatar. So it's a difference. You come with a different culture, with the notion of citizenship and local development, etc. So certainly that there is an effect of the hosting countries on the behavior of these immigrants and their impact on development. So recommendations for Morocco is to use these trends, to use immigrants more strategically, to use NGOs more strategically, and to improve inequality indexes by having more equity in the taxation system, and I think that here there should be a much more clear message, because till now the exemption of agriculture sector is seen by people, general people, as a tool to help farmers. But as I said, it's not helping farmers. They would be exempted anyway. And so there should be some redistribution, real distribution. Spending also, we have free education from the basic education to university education. I don't think it's realistic if you have 40% of illiterates to treat in the same way basic education and higher education. There should be some shift of resources towards fundamental and basic education, towards illiteracy, instead of financing, of giving everything free. So demagogic attitude also towards this kind of free education, etc., should be changed and be more realistic, more that it's not really patriotic position to say that university should be free for all, and some resources should be shifted to the basic education. So these are really.
Yes, hello. Let me introduce my delegation here to Lebanon. My question is relating, you've mentioned the contribution of NGOs to the development in Morocco in the recent years. My question would be, what has been the role, to your view, of other donors, in particular institutional donors? The European Union is very active in Morocco, also the World Bank, European Investment Bank is very active also in infrastructure development, also the African Development Bank is very active. And these have a leverage, much higher leverage than NGOs in the development of the country, because it's not just acting on a micro scale, it's also on policy dialogue. They're also helping define policies, they're doing budget support, and they're helping to privatization, they're helping to private sector development, enlarging access to finance, as you were mentioning also. Also for fiscal reform, good governance, human rights. There's such a wide range of areas in which maybe all these institutional donors have been active. What has been the role, or how will you interpret all this in relation to your work?
Yes. Yeah, the role of international donors. The role has been important. European Union and also country, European country at the country level, the German, the Belgian, the French, etc. And their impact has been important. The difference, what I was stressing in the presentation, is the difference compared to Egypt and Syria is that you have also an enabling environment in Morocco, like this possibility given to NGOs to have access to donors, international donors. So money used to go to the government. But with this reform in NGO code or NGO law, it has been possible to have partnership directly with NGOs, and has been very positive. It started with NGOs and training NGOs and introducing, new managerial approach to civil society and to NGOs. So it has been very, very important. Now, over the last few years, donors also shifted money to the state through this initiative, because the message from the state was that no, give us the money and we can redistribute it. It's you have now threats that are so important that an international donor cannot be able to contact civil society directly, which can be. I don't reject completely this approach, but the approach by the state should change itself. So yes, to your question, but the role of international donor was also made possible through microcredit association and NGOs, because there is also this legal and regulatory environment that was favorable. And some donors were interested by Morocco because they can see the results of their money. While if they give money to Egypt, it will be at the level of the Egyptian government. They know that if they give it to an NGO in Morocco, in a very small village, they can see that there is a project based on this money, etc. So it was also an incentive for international donors to be interested in Morocco, and a lot of money have been flowed to Morocco through this. Has flown to Morocco through this.
I agree with you. The thing is that both approaches are complementary, because you need policy dialogue to establish reform of several policies. Then you can act at micro level on specific projects, specific areas that a big donor cannot cover. But the policy, social aspects, or business environment, facilitation of the business environment, are things that an NGO cannot tackle directly with the government. So that's why I think that there is this very complementary approach between micro level with NGOs and then some other policy dialogue with the government, vis-a-vis the government. But I think
Yeah, I just wanted to ask about, I thought it was peculiar that the fertility rate is the least compared to the other countries that you mentioned. And from my limited knowledge, we could see how other nations probably have this burden of increased population. So my question is basically, based on your knowledge of Morocco, what sociological factors have encouraged this trend of a decrease in fertility? And just to develop my question further, Rhoda Kanane, in her book, her ethnography on Palestine, titled Birthing the Nation, she studies discourse on modernity and resistance, and how this discourse is acted out in people's consumer patterns, in their family planning, and even in their educational paths. So then we could also link this to literacy. So, and there's this idea that, and we could also link this to the gross number of remittances coming from outside. So is there an idea towards modernity that a smaller family size would be achieving a modern status as opposed to the negative Badawi, backward status? Are there these forces within Moroccan society? And then this would follow up on Dr. Paul's question, how to see how other nations can bring this trend to their country, because in Palestine you had internal factors, so the state was encouraging smaller family planning, but also, interestingly enough, you had Israeli kind of plans. They were opening up hospitals to encourage smaller families because of the demography issue. So basically what forces are acting on that? Thank you.
Okay, the dynamics in Morocco is a bit different from the dynamics in Palestine. Surely, we have marriage is the exclusive way to have children. So, and marriage is related to a number of conditions. Some of them are socioeconomic factors. So you really need to have an explanation to study carefully these factors, and there is the factor, the economic factor, that says that there is a delay in the age of marriage, and the age of marriage, the delay of the age of marriage is related to two factors: longer education and access to labor market. There is certainly much more difficulty today to access labor market compared to 20 years ago, especially for educated people. But you also have urbanization, because if you take Morocco, it's much more urbanized compared to Egypt, for instance. So urbanization imposes also new standards. To be married, you need to have a house, you need to have, so it's much more costly for Moroccan to be married than for somebody who is in rural area. So you have this transformation, urbanization. To what extent is urbanization means modernity is a big issue I don't tackle here, but you certainly, from an economic point of view, you have the cost of having children and the return of these children. In the past, most Moroccan were in the rural area. They use their children to work for them or to work with them, and it's not costly because they don't need to educate them, etc. You still have some of that. But you also have a huge flow of people that migrate to the urban area with the consequences on fertility. So I think that the urbanization process has been much more rapid in Morocco compared to the two other countries, which triggered. The second factor is a factor that related to the Maghreb versus the Mashreq. And I don't have an explanation, but it's just an observation, is in the Maghreb, even Algeria has much higher fertility rates in the 60s and 70s, but it declined much faster than in other Mashreq countries that had the same fertility rates. So is there an impact, a local neighbor impact? Tunisia started the process of fertility decline much earlier and then moved to Morocco and Algeria, probably because people are also observing, and we know that Tunisia has been always quoted as
who were taken out of poverty in Morocco through this shift. It would be interesting, in the paper or in somewhere, obviously, to delve a bit into them, because again, the paper, there's a lot of good news and then there's bad news, and one is not sure, does the bad news, so at some point you say this is not maybe sustainable, and hence there's a question, will these slide back into poverty or not? So I think it's worth to delve a little bit and analyze who are these new exiters from poverty who've made it in a very small way, how, in what ways, or are they the literate, or some of them are the illiterate? Is it sustainable? And if so, how and why? I mean, there's no doubt that the bad news that you give us is bad and needs to be addressed. But this little bit of good news, that success story there, and the beneficiaries of it would probably tell us a lot also, and tell the reader a lot about when do these things succeed. Are they all in the rural areas? Are they all in the urban areas? Are women doing better than men? And we didn't hear that. We heard the statistical result that poverty was here, now it's here, and then we moved on and we got into the factors of why, and then we moved into the bad news, but we didn't really get to know these people as clusters of success and those stories.
Sorry, thanks. The issue of vulnerability, because I don't know exactly what's the situation in Morocco, but from what I understand from the rest of the region, at least from, the Egypt onwards, is that more than the issue of poverty itself is the issue of vulnerability to poverty. And so this is another set of challenges, and also it requires another set of policy responses. So I was wondering what was including, for example, looking at social protection mechanism, not only looking at social assistance, but also looking at social insurance. And I was wondering what was the situation in Morocco in terms of what's the size, so poverty has reduced, but what's the size of vulnerable, the vulnerable poor? In the rest of the region, you have 20 million people in vulnerable employment and loads and millions of working poor. So what's the situation in Morocco? What are the policies? And this also brings me back to you, for example, in terms of policies, you were mentioning micro-enterprise. Well, depending on, I guess, but you'll tell me what, depending on the setting of the program, whether you said it was for rural areas and a lot for women. Well, how sustainable are these micro businesses? What kind of micro businesses it is? Is it handicrafts, more charity oriented thing, or is it real kind of businesses, productive businesses? Because this will tell you, okay, well, with this kind of micro enterprise program, you might achieve, a reduction in poverty because at that present time, people have a business. But if it's handicraft or if it's whatever, I don't know, any kind of vulnerable business, then you're not really designing a policy that ensures that people are out of vulnerability. And so this is one thing. Same thing for remittances. Well, you have remittances, people have money, and depending on where it's invested and how this money is dealt with, it can go into productive reinvestment, education, health, whatever, which will help them get out of poverty and vulnerability, or it can, only reduce punctually poverty. So I think if we keep this dichotomy in mind, poverty and vulnerability to poverty and associated policy responsive, it also gives us an idea of the picture of, but I don't know how it is in Morocco, and I just know that in the rest of the region it's something we're trying to pay attention to. Sorry.
Yes, these are in fact very important questions, and in the paper, in fact, I detailed much more the limits, because in fact the limits are so important that the success is not sustainable, in fact. Why? Because here, from the UNDP point of view, it's MDG 1. It's moving people out from poverty. Now you asked where they are now. This is a big issue, because you have the poverty line and people move out of the poverty line, and then it's done. But in fact, the issue is how long are they going to be there, And do they have any chance to move beyond? Because the issue also is to move beyond. If you are not poor, you become vulnerable. Vulnerable means that it's poverty line times 1.5. So you have 50% more than poor. But on average, you are still poor. Do you have a middle class, or do you have a class that can be economically and socially viable and can push for modernity and development? And no, because and this is why education is very important. Education, sometimes even poverty has been achieved at the expense of education, because people don't go to school and go to work. So they have some income. They are not poor, but they have no perspective. Probably that if Egypt or Syria are now going to school for a better future, then it's better. But if we are just not going to school to have some income, and this will continue forever, so then we'll stay vulnerable, or with a very low poverty rate, but with no perspective. So this is really a big issue, and policymakers should really be aware that if we don't give people the social and economic rights, I call it, that would allow them to be independent, as you said. Okay, today we have remittances, but are these remittances sustainable as well? We don't think so, because there are limitations in migration policies in Europe, because you have third and fourth generation of migrants that would like to live in Europe or in the US, and don't send money, or reduce the amount of money that they can spend. So we need to have something sustainable. It's literacy, educate people. It's redistribution, sustainable redistribution mechanisms. This is why the initiative, or any initiative, is not something sustainable. You just, instead of reforming the social policy, you just append an initiative. And I found it very strange. Strange, it's understandable within it's so difficult to change things that even the king has to create its own initiatives to be able to carry things forward. So these are the way. Otherwise, you just move people, as I said, beyond the poverty line, but any shock can move them down the poverty line. It can be just having 2 successive years of drought, of no rain. It could be the fact that the guy who is in Europe lost his job, which can be the case with the international crisis and much of the migrants in Spain or France or things like that, etc. The activities, you said the question about activities. This is also to what extent they can be sustainable. And you can probably, if you start in a village having a small project, it can work. But if you create 10 similar projects, then the return on these projects cannot be as high as was the first project. So if people don't have the skills to differentiate and to create much more innovative things, and to be able to market their product, etc. So all these go to the sustainable factors of development. So there is a poverty decline driven by some factors, but the issue is how to make this trend sustainable. So I hope I answered your question. Vulnerability exists as well in Morocco, and most of these people out of poverty are now in vulnerability. Okay.
Last question.
Yes.
Big question.
Okay, no.
The Narcotic Drug Control Board in the United Nations, in its annual report, mentions that Morocco is still a major export country of cannabis, hashish. When we say drug, we say money. What the influence to the economy? Thank you.
Okay, so there is a region in the north of Morocco which lives mainly on cannabis. And this region is known for a long time was marginalized. So it's a region that has no other source of income except cannabis. Over the last years, there was an important interest from the central government to channel resources and interests in those regions in order to make other activities attractive for people. Because if you ask somebody who has 1 hectare in cannabis to transform it into cereals, it would not make sense for him. Huh? Yeah, exactly. So there is a huge program, and international donors, to come back to European Union, and are also helping in that sense in order to make it possible and economically a choice for them to move out of cannabis to other activities.
Well, I think we might conclude our Q&A section. So unless there's another, I just want to thank Lahsan for this presentation, and thank you for coming. And if there's no further questions and answers, please stick around, have some food, have a discussion. And thanks all for coming. And Lahsan will
Thank you all for coming.